Hello, and welcome to the North Carolina Blue Wave, where we talk to Democratic candidates shaping the future of North Carolina. I'm your host, Cara Pearson, the chair of the Robeson County Democratic Party, and today our special guest is Maurice Mo Green, candidate for North Carolina State Superintendent. And for this interview, I hope you don't mind if I refer to you as Mo.
No, that'll be wonderful. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
All right. Mo has a wealth of experience in education and leadership. And today we're going to dive into his vision for the future of education in North Carolina with a special focus on how it impacts rural communities like Robeson County. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
First, tell us briefly about yourself, your background, and why you're running for the North Carolina State Superintendent.
Great. So my background includes having been the superintendent of Guilford County Schools for 7.5 years. So Guilford County Schools would be the third largest district in the state, includes Greensboro and High Point, North Carolina, about 70,000 or so students. Before that, I was the deputy superintendent and the general counsel for Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools, also for about 7.5 years, and Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools being one of the two largest districts in the state. Also have served as the executive director for the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which supports many causes in North Carolina, including public education. Did that for 7 years. And then also served on any number of boards that do things in support of public education, including issues around homelessness, the arts, athletics. I was the president of the North Carolina High School Athletic Association for a term, media, policy, community support. Why am I running? Certainly believe that we can improve student achievement across our state. I'm deeply concerned about the direction of our public schools with regards to funding of our public schools, and deeply concerned about the level of, I like to say, disrespect being shown to our educators as well, and believe certainly that my experience and background can help to turn that around with a new vision going forward. And I also have to confess, because I have retired from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, that it did take a call from the governor's office and ultimately a conversation with Governor Cooper that where he convinced me to run for this office.
Awesome. And for those who do not understand the role of the state superintendent, how does this role influence policies?
Great. So I like to think of this role as having two major purposes. The first is to be the chief administrative officer for public schools, and then the second is to be the chief advocacy officer for public schools. So unpack both of those. Chief administrative officer. So this is a position that leads and guides over 2,500 schools uh, across the state of North Carolina. 1.4 million students, administers a budget of $11 billion annually, licenses over 100,000 employees, works with the State Board of Education on establishing things like the standard course of study, the various assessments, and the accountability model. That is also at this point done in conjunction with the General Assembly. On the advocacy side, then, I would lift up that this is the position that's called upon to provide a wealth of information to lots of different individuals and organizations, including the governor, including the General Assembly, including the general public. And in addition to providing the information, this position is called upon to advocate for and on behalf of public schools for the state of North Carolina, lifting up what the challenges are, and then offering potential solutions to those.
Speaking of challenges, what would you say that are the biggest challenges that face North Carolina education system right now, and how do you plan to address them?
Great. So I would lift up a number of issues that I think are deeply concerning. The first would be funding of our public school system for the state. So just a bit of context may be important. So North Carolina is currently ranked 48 in the nation with regards to public education funding. If you compare North Carolina on a per pupil basis compared to the national average, for example, national average is about $16,000. Even if you compare it to Virginia, which is a little over $14,000 per pupil, South Carolina is a little over $15,000 per pupil, North Carolina is a little over $11,000 per pupil. You times that times 1.4 million students, and you can really see the dramatic difference in funding compared to other states right next to us and the nation as a whole. Another thing that I would lift up then is where I talked earlier about the disrespect being shown to our educators. That shows up in things like compensation, where we're also certainly close to the bottom with regards to compensation. But it's more than that, even the level of just respect that we show in other ways to our educators. We've got leaders who say things like Mark Robinson calls our educators wicked people. My opponent even has said that our public schools have been taken over by Satan and that they're absolute cesspools of evil, lies, and deception. So these are the sorts of rhetoric that's out there, and I believe these are deeply concerning. And then the last thing I'll mention, certainly, is student achievement. We have pockets of wonderful success, and then issues that are deeply where we have lots of room for improvement. How do I address those issues then? So on the first two issues, particularly the first issue, is really a matter of advocating for more funding, calling on others to advocate for more funding as well. Certainly with the educator issue, certainly advocating, but also then trying to change the mindset of the way folks think about educators. I like to talk about we should be revering our educators and then trying to be sure that we put things in place that shows that reverence, working on working conditions as an example, trying to be sure we have strong leadership in each and every one of our schools, which will also elevate all of the educators in the building as well. And then the last thing, the student achievement, certainly more money helps, but we have to do other things as well. We have to raise the level of expectations for our students, which means we have to raise the expectations of what our educators do as well. We have to think about, in some instances, making wholesale changes in who is in our buildings, working with our students. We have to think about how we might provide additional resources. In some instances, we've got to recognize that this may require that some places, some schools, some school districts may require more funding than other schools and school districts as well.
Awesome. So teacher retention is like a major concern in rural areas. What steps would you take to attract and retain quality educators in Robeson County and similar rural areas?
Right. So, first of all, again, we have to lift up compensation as a first and important issue. And when I talk about compensation, sometimes people think and run right to things like incentives, performance pay, bonuses, those sorts of things. And I'm not opposed to those things, but we must start with base compensation first. We've got to elevate the level of base compensation so that positions in all parts of our state, but in particular in our rural communities, would be attractive to folks to come into. Beyond that, I certainly think that we've got to think about other ways of bringing in educators. And so for me, that means, certainly looking at our schools of education. One of the things that I've been starting to have conversations about is trying to encourage students while in college to think about whatever degree they get, they also get a teacher's license. We've got to think about recruiting from other locations. So there are parts of our country that are losing enrollment. And so we've got to be aggressive in trying to get those folks to come and look at North Carolina. I'm a big fan of programs like Teach for America. The what's now called participating learning used to be called visiting international faculty, as ways to also bring in additional staff as well. Yeah, I also think that we've got to be sure that we're growing our own. So we used to have the teacher fellows program that was eliminated. It's now coming back in incremental ways, if you will. We're trying to think about how you might impress upon young people, even while in high school, that this is a noble profession and one that they ought to be involved in. And then finally, um, I think it's critically important that we think about how to impress upon folks who might be thinking about a second career, that education may be exactly what they need to be doing. In particular, in our rural communities where folks, oftentimes I tell folks, no one is going to come save us. We're going to have to figure out how to do that ourselves in some instances. And so finding folks who may be thinking about, maybe what I'm doing right now is not fully satisfying me, and think about, the pathway to maybe having a second career in education might be actually very satisfying.
I'm going to mesh two of your responses together for the next question. So okay. You talked about teacher pay and advocating for funding. So as a state superintendent, you're required to work with the North Carolina General Assembly to get that funding. How do you see yourself in terms of advocating, as you mentioned, advocating for funding with them and getting support from the General Assembly to achieve the goals that you have in mind that you mentioned earlier?
Right. So the way that I operate is it's not called as a brand, but I listen and then learn and then lead. And it's called Mo Wants to Know. It started when I was superintendent of Guilford County Schools and even continued when I was the executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. So the way that I operate is I have lots of conversations with folks, try to listen to folks, try to hear what their concerns are, and then try to figure out if there are nuggets that we might be able to pull, move, something forward. And so in this instance, that's the way I'll operate. One thing that's maybe embedded in your question is, it's this assumption perhaps that the General Assembly will remain somewhat the same, if you will, which may be how it turns out. But I also think that now is the time, if there ever was, it's next 20-something days, if they're voting party next week, to think about trying to get more champions of public education in our General Assembly, because that then makes those conversations easier to have as well. Then the final thing I'll lift up is another way that I operate is I recognize that you have to have different and varied voices talking to folks and listening to folks to move certain things forward. And so I tell folks this is not a situation where it's solely Mo Green. It requires all of us to have the kind of conversations with folks. And oftentimes people might hear something from one person, even when they can't hear it from the very next person who says it the same exact way. And so bringing in the business community, faith community, our school leaders, our students, our parents, the list is long of folks that we need to bring forward into these conversations.
So let's say that you get the desired budget that you want. What is the priorities or initiatives that you would initially implement, and how one of the things that's a issue in rural areas is feeling like they're receiving equitable resources. So how would you ensure that when you get that desired budget, what would happen?
Great. First of all, I do believe that we have to focus on our educators first. And let me be clear, when I use the term educators, I'm certainly talking about teachers, but I'm talking about other folks as well, including our custodians, our cafeteria workers, our bus drivers. The list is long, but increasing the compensation for all of those individuals would be a high priority for me. The second thing then would certainly be differentiating resources in an equitable manner. And so that does mean that communities like Robeson County or other low wealth communities, or the Leandro, the original Leandro districts, would be among the communities that I would be focusing on trying to provide additional resources first. And I would focus on particular things within those communities. Certainly would continue the work around early literacy skills that has already started, but it would also be thinking about how do we increase, like, for example, at the high school level, access to more career and technical education courses at the same time that we also try to increase access to college level courses as well. We must do this in a equitable manner, which means an unequal manner, because our districts are not the same, our schools are not the same, and so we've got to recognize that the populations in those schools are not the same, the level of resources that they may have access to are not the same, and so we've got to think about how to do that in the most equitable fashion possible.
So, if Trump is elected, Project 2025 outlines various policy changes that would impact public education in North Carolina. What concerns do you have about how this plan might impact or affect school funding and resources?
I have deep concern about Project 2025 and if it were to be enacted around educational issues. So context, I think, is important because it will drive why I have the deep concern. In North Carolina, about 10% of districts' budgets, and it's going to vary by district, but on average, about 10% of district budgets dollars are coming from the federal government. And so when you think about the kinds of dollars that are coming in, there are things for like Title I schools, as an example. So these are schools that provide additional resources to schools that have high levels of students with low socioeconomic status. You think about special needs. Significant dollars come from the federal government to support students with special needs. And the list goes on and on. But those would be just two examples of where, if you think about those dollars going away, the dramatic impact that would have on our schools. Already, we're woefully already underfunding our schools. This would only make it much, much worse. So I'm very clear that we must have those dollars continue to come in and be supportive of our public schools.
Yes. Speaking of the funding going away in Project, one of the goals of the Project 2025 is to increase the role of private and charter schools, and how, of course, it's going to have an impact on the public school system. How would you attempt to protect the North Carolina public school system if this happens?
Right. And so, you don't even have to look to Project 2025 in this instance, because within our own state, there is a dramatic increase in funding going to private schools. And I want to just be clear, charter schools are public schools. So let's talk about private schools, however. With the taxpayer-funded private school voucher program, you're talking about literally hundreds of millions of dollars that are now going into private schools. And that'll turn into projected $5 billion or more dollars over the next 10 years. These are dollars that are desperately needed in our public school system. And it's deeply troubling that these dollars are going for any student, regardless of income. So you're talking about the wealthiest of the wealthy being able to take advantage of this. These are folks who can already afford to send their child to a private school. You're talking about folks who may already have their children in private school and can afford it, being able to take advantage of it. So this is deeply concerning. So then to have the federal government in essence, put a stamp of approval on, continuing this sort of mechanism, I think is deeply concerning for North Carolinians. And so, what will I do? I will be advocating as strongly as possible against this continued movement, trying to be sure that folks understand the significant impact it will have on our public schools. And one thing that we have learned is that when folks hear the term, this taxpayer-funded voucher program it's entitled Opportunity Scholarships, and so oftentimes people don't think about the fact that these are their tax dollars that are going to private schools that are not even held to any kind of accountability measures, right? And so once folks get a better sense of the fact that these are their dollars, as opposed to, when I was at the D. Smith Reynolds Foundation, we provided scholarships. Other foundation provides scholarships. And so folks might think, well, these are dollars coming from some other source. They're not our publicly funded, taxpayer funded dollars. And so when folks sort of understand that, then more and more people actually become opposed to it. When people understand that in a place like, I don't know exactly for your community, but in many rural communities, there are very few private schools. And so the dollars that are coming from your community, your taxpayer dollars, are actually not even staying in your community. You're paying for some student who may be in Wake County or Guilford County or Charlotte to keep their child in a private school. That cannot be something that most people will be pleased about. And so I think when they hear that, their advocacy will only accelerate.
Yeah, that was an interesting nugget. So changing to your opponent, what distinguishes your vision of North Carolina education from Michelle Morrow, and how does your approach make you the right candidate?
Great. So I'll talk about vision, but I'll also talk about maybe three other distinguishing characteristics between the two of us. Certainly my vision is one that utilizes a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. And to combine it with a focus on excellence. That's the vision we utilized in Guilford County schools, where we saw dramatic increases in graduation rates, increases in academic performance. We had more of our students taking and passing college level courses and exams. We were able to start schools focus on science, technology, engineering, and math, Parent Academy. We were also able to create a scholarship endowment fund. And the district was also recognized as a National District of Character. So that's what we want to bring forward. When I hear my opponent's vision, is often couched with, language that will suggest, some positive things for students, but it's surrounded by deep rhetoric about our schools are broken, our schools are unsafe, and we need to do lots of things to, basically dismantle our schools. She's very supportive of our dollars going to private schools, as an example. And so that's the vision that, at least as I hear it from her. The three distinguishing characteristics, though, I think are really important. One is experience, the second is belief, the third is character. With regards to experience, you've heard a little bit about mine, as opposed to my opponent who homeschools her children. Nothing against homeschooling, but you're talking about, again, the chief administrative officer for public schools, someone who has got to run a massive educational operation. I'm the one that has that level of experience. Belief in our public schools, I believe in them, my wife and I. We put our children in our public schools, as opposed to my opponent who calls for, calls the schools all sorts of things, as I've mentioned before, including absolute cesspools of evil, lies, and deception, and taken over by Satan. And then third is character, what we tried to do in Guilford County schools to make character development equally as important as academic outcomes. My opponent, she took her own children to the insurrection on January 6th, 2021, comes back from that the same night where there literally has been loss of life, puts herself on camera and calls President Trump, says, you're in office 2 more weeks. How about you set aside the U.S. Constitution, invoke the Insurrection Act, which is essentially bring in the military, have them rule and arrest folks for treason if they help certify the 2020 election. This is a person who has called for the executions of many, including President Biden, Governor Cooper, has called for the public execution on pay-per-view of President Barack Obama. And I like to tell folks, we've now created something called the ABCs of Morrow. You can go to a website called abcmorrow.com. Every letter is something that she has said, and oftentimes put her own self on video that will call into question her character and whether this is the kind of character we want next to our children. So strong difference in vision, but also then in experience, belief in our public schools, and character.
Wow. So with school shootings happening more frequently than ever across the country, school safety is a growing concern for many parents and educators. How do you plan to address safety in the schools across North Carolina?
Right. So I do believe that you've got to have a very comprehensive approach to safety issues. Again, where this might differ from my opponent who talks about just increasing law enforcement as or having a code of conduct. I would lift up four things, which there are many others that you've got to also have in place. The first of which is I do believe we've got to have more mental health professionals working with our students. Many of our students are going through significant mental challenges, and so having professionals that can work with them is critically important. My opponent says it's not the business of our public schools to counsel our students. A difference between us. Secondly, would be certainly we do have to have effective relationships with law enforcement, recognizing that they do have an important role in being sure that our schools are safe. Now, not everything requires a law enforcement response. Some requires school administration and other educators to respond. Third would certainly be what I call hardening of our facilities. So doing things like having double entries, right? Having things like cameras in certain locations, having metal detectors that folks have to walk through as they're entering in our facilities, so to make the facility safer. And I should just note with those last two things, when I was the deputy superintendent of CMS, I actually supervise a law enforcement division. So I have lots of experience working with law enforcement on these very issues. And then the last thing I'll lift up is something we did in Guilford County Schools that we want to take to the state is character development. Do think that helping our students understand how to behave and comport themselves appropriately, how to be in relationship with each other, even when they're in disagreement with each other, is critically important to having safer schools.
So full disclosure, my mother is a retired North Carolina educator. And there has been an ongoing debate between her and her retiree friends on whether they benefit more from a bonus or from a COLA, cost of living adjustment. So what is your position on this issue, and how would you address this if you're elected?
Great. So I think it's a healthy debate one can have. I think, first of all, I don't know that it should be an either or, but a both and. But I would start with, if you had to choose one, it would be a cost of living adjustment, because then once that's in place and will remain in place for future years as well. So you're constantly building on top of an adjustment each year, as opposed to a bonus that might be in place one year and then not in place the next year. So you're not actually getting the benefit beyond the year that you receive the bonus. Now, the cost of living adjustment to be effective has to be a really good adjustment, right? I mean, it cannot be so minimal that you really don't feel it or see it or be able to utilize it in any sort of positive way. And so, I think it needs to be, something that is at a minimum, you know, um, at least comes close to covering inflation, and I would suggest even higher than that. So that you actually feel like you actually are getting an adjustment that is beneficial to you.
Awesome. Um, so for those that are listening, what is the best way for them to stay engaged and involved in the education issues that matter most to them?
Great. So, with regards to my campaign, you can go to mogreenfornc.com. You'll find a wealth of information about me there. You can also sign up to volunteer through that website. You can also donate because that becomes critically important for us to get the message out about me and actually about my opponent as well. Um, you can also find out more about the vision that I've set forward, along with various pillars and strategic direction, recognizing that it's not a fully baked plan because the way that I operate is back to that Mo wants to know. I'll bring in many more folks to have conversations with before we finalize a strategic plan, but you can at least get a sense of where that's going as.
Awesome. So, what message would you like to send to the voters of Robeson County and other rural areas about your vision for North Carolina education future? Or is it anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to fill in the blanks?
Oh, absolutely. So, again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And certainly, I tell folks all the time that my resume at this point has to speak for itself. So, folks can learn more about me and what we try to do, for example, in Guilford County Schools. What I did when I was executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. For those who don't know, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation actually funds the low wealth plaintiff districts in the long-standing Leandro litigation. So I have had immense relationship with low wealth districts through that effort over the years as well, and know how critically important it is to push these matters forward. Maybe I'll end with a little bit more of a personal note, and that is I've been married for 32 years and have two children. Blessed to have two children, both of whom graduated from our public schools. And 6 years ago, no idea I'd be running for this position, wrote a letter to Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools where they started and Guilford County schools where they graduated from, thanking our public school educators for the marvelous job they have done in both of our children. Some have called it a love letter to public school educators. So that's a little bit more on a personal level of how much I appreciate public education, all it's done for me and for my family, and what I would hope to do for many, many families if elected.
Awesome closing message. Um, that's all the time that we have for today's episode of North Carolina Blue Wave. A big thank you to Mo Green for joining us and sharing his vision for the future of education in North Carolina. If you would like to learn more about his campaign for state superintendent, he gave you the website address and we'll put it on the screen. And be sure to visit his campaign, social media. And as always, thank you for watching and listening to this podcast. Let's keep the conversation going, and don't forget to let your voice heard at the ballot box. Vote Maurice Green. Until next time, I'm your host, Cara Pearson, chair of the Robeson County Democratic Party. Thank you.
Thank you.